Hey everyone, hi. Thank you so much for taking out time. And I actually wanted to rename it to AWS Security. I mean, I actually was going with the introduction to AWS, but I changed the name real quick because AWS Security is much more relatable when it comes to this presentation. Not because I talk about AWS security in depth or just an overview, not in depth, but because when we are here in Mystikcon, we are talking. I mean, a lot of intellectual people over here talked about the security concepts. So I think introduction to AWS security does more justice to this presentation. So thank you for giving me the stage. And for those who don't know about me, my name is Lalit Sharma. That's my real name. I work with Paytm as a security engineer. It's been close to 1 year, uh, me working over there. But in the information security industry, I've been here for around 4 years ish. I am always reachable via Twitter and LinkedIn. These are my Twitter and LinkedIn handles. After the end of presentation, I will make sure that the presentation is uploaded and is accessible to you in the near future if someone wishes to view the contents and wants to revisit what has been missed. So going ahead, when we think about cloud, cloud is necessarily not AWS. We have a lot of service providers when it comes to cloud service providers, such AWS being the top leader because it's been in the market for around 14 years. But Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, IBM, Oracle, Alibaba Cloud, there's so many vendors out here. And the number is not getting lesser. It's growing, should I say, day by day. But these are the prominent players which you would find in chartings like Gartner Magic Quadrant. And AWS is the leader, and that's why a lot of people prefer AWS, not just because it's Gartner Magic Quadrant leader, but it offers more than 175 services. That's really huge number. Um, when it comes to these 175 services, most of these services revolve around computing, storage, database, and more. So when it comes to computing, EC2, the very familiar acronym, which stands for Elastic Cloud Compute, which provides you a virtual machine over cloud, in which you don't have to perform any sort of configuration. You just have to specify your details if you want to go for a higher RAM or higher CPU or higher GPU, and then you can start an instance. Storage, S3 is the uh, biggest offering of AWS, and when it comes to storage, S3 is the first thing that comes to mind. Although there are a lot of storage services, those who may not know, such as should I say EBS, Elastic Block Storage, EFS, Elastic File Storage, and there are a lot more services. But needless to say, EC2, S3, RDS, DynamoDB, and AWS Lambda, these are 4 or 5 core services and the significant ones which the industry is utilizing. There are many more, but these 5 services you will always find in their architecture. The good thing about AWS is that some services are free, but that's till a certain limit. Some are pay as you use, not when you need it. So let's say if you're using EC2 service, till a certain extent and till a certain limit, you're able to use it without paying anything. But when you exceed that threshold, you're bound to pay an additional amount. Uh, some other services, such as uh, Elastic IP, they are built right from the provisioning of the service. So let's say if you start off by getting an Elastic IP for your EC2 instance, for those who do not know what an Elastic IP is, it's AWS allots you an IP, which allows you to which is a static IP, and that allows your EC2 instance to be public and to be reachable via a single address. So when it comes to AWS security testing, I do want to go over these services which are offered by AWS, but since there are a lot of services and we're talking about security over here, I would not be able to cover all those services. I would love to, but we would have to cover another session for that. But right now, when it comes to testing your AWS services, a lot of services you can test them out. You can perform penetration testing. You can perform vulnerability assessment. For penetration testing, you always need to consult your AWS service provider and take a written consent from them, because as the engagements, the terms of engagements of a penetration test say that you have to have a written consent from your service providers or from client. So in this case, AWS is not an exception. AWS allows you to have a form in which you need to specify the assets and the time frame for which you want to perform a penetration test. And the whole details are given on AWS website. I'll leave a link. Right now it's not there in the slide, but I'll modify it and leave the link for you to refer. Uh, in AWS security, most of the part is compliance, because these services are require these services require configuration. But some of the services like your EC2, your S3, and your VPC, if if left publicly exposed, can cause a lot of troubles. So for that purpose, you have your AWS inspector, and the people who utilize AWS VPC or configure their AWS as to be, internal resource or as an extension to their data center. Nmap is really, really good utility. Um, when it comes to testing out your AWS, misconfiguration of S3 buckets is a really, really significant issue. And it's not just me who's highlighting these issues. A lot of security researchers highlight this misconfigured S3 bucket in their bug bounty programs. Uh, those who are associated to security must know, I mean, they're familiar with platforms such as HackerOne, Bugcrowd, and Synack Red Team, and a lot of reports contain misconfigured AWS S3 buckets, and they were able to list out the contents of S3 buckets, leading to sensitive data exposure, or some credentials of some platform, or any random detail which is apparently very significant to the customer or to the client. Uh, when it comes to testing your AWS, if you're provisioning AWS for your private infrastructure, a regular VAPT exercise is a must, because when it comes to AWS, they share a they have this shared responsibility model in which they mention that in some cases, they're going to take care of certain aspects, but in other cases, the customer who is utilizing those AWS services has to take care. And this covers patching, applying patches to the EC2 underlying operating system of the AWS EC2, and whatever application are installed. If there are vulnerable to any CVE that is existing, they need to update it to the latest version. And VAPT, like I said, has to be you know uh, signed by AWS in order to to perform VAPT on those devices. But there's a catch that you cannot perform VAPT of the underlying resources, such as the hardware on top of which your EC2 instance is running. Um, uh, the whole details of the shared responsibility model, I'll drop a link uh, in this slide. But there's a fine line on what services you can perform VAPT and what services you can't. And for those who are running web applications on their EC2 instances and APIs, uh, a routine VAPT of those web services really is helpful, because let's say if your web application is prone to SSRF or local file read, or worse, remote code execution, people who understand these vulnerabilities surely understand what kind of impact can lead onto those services. And last but not the least, your data storage. So when it comes to storing your critical data onto those AWS services, like for instance, if you're using AWS RDS or DynamoDB, or simply you install a MySQL services on your EC2 instances, what kind of data you store is more important than what are the services that you're running. You may run managed services. Those managed services can be compliant to a lot of compliances such as PCI or ISO 27001, XYZ, any kind of compliance. But if you do not configure it properly and you're storing sensitive data and information onto that, uh, things can go south side. And sensitive data storage is really a big aspect of you know uh, AWS security, and that is one particular aspect where you can perform your testing as to what kind of services are exposed to the public internet, what ports are open if you're using AWS EC2, for AWS RDS and DynamoDB, what kind of users or which users in your organization can access to that data, or in general, which user can access that data. So as I said about AWS Inspector, it's a really good utility that comes from AWS. It's a relatively new utility which allows you to perform not only network assessment but host assessment. So it does a check for your vulnerable software such as CVE. It performs benchmarking according to CIS benchmarks. For those who don't know what CIS is, it's actually a collection of benchmarks which is used for hardening your operating system, your database, such as Oracle, your Amazon Linux, AMIs, so on and so forth. So you can perform benchmarking using your AWS Inspector. And as this particular section shows that there is a pricing also. I mean, with AWS, always there is a pricing factor that's always gonna be there. uh, those people who are inclined to use AWS services must look out for the pricing that is involved, because let's say if you utilize that service, you don't want to have such a huge bill, and then things go south side when it comes to not checking out the price but utilizing the services. um, I would say that have a um, I would say have a billing alert enabled for your AWS account if you're really inclined and if you're really interested to use. It's really a great service and a great platform, but have a look out for the pricing involved for each and every services, because yes, you have free services for some, but then there is always a pricing involved. And so AWS Inspector has a pricing of around $61 per month for a network assessment. And this would be for 100 instances. Let's say if your VPC or your AWS infrastructure has 100 hosts, or should I say 100 instances, then the cost is going to be around $61 per month for 100 instances assessed weekly. When it comes to host assessments, you need to install AWS Inspector Agent, just like you would install your Tenable Nessus agents on your instances, or should I say, on your virtual machines when it comes to your private data center or private infrastructure in an organization. For those who have used Qualys or Nessus, they would be able to relate very closely to this. So the inspector what it does in host assessments is that it will check for the vulnerable software that's running onto the instances. It will check for hardening measures as to what kind of controls are not applied and should be applied to your EC2 instances, and security best practices. So let's say, for instance, if you have one of the share open and is accessible by almost every user, such as your root user and every other user, you need to take care of and you need to take care of that share, but you somehow forget. AWS Inspector will help you out on that. So this is a lot more about AWS Inspector, and like I said, it's an automated security assessment service that helps in improving the security and compliance of your application deployed on AWS. So most of your vulnerabilities, most of your CVEs, most of your hardening controls and deviations from best practices, these all are covered on your AWS Inspector, and it provides you alerting as well. So one more thing that I would like to notify over here, that people who have used Qualys or Nessus may not confuse it as a should I say a vulnerability assessment utility. Yes, it does these checks such as CVEs or CIS controls. Yes, it is mimicking those features that are given by your Qualys as well as Nessus, but still people don't go for uh, AWS Inspector over Qualys and Nessus. Reason being that Qualys and Nessus are daily updated with their database, and AWS Inspector is a bit slower in that aspect. Because AWS is just your service provider and not a security firm, that is why it will provide you the general best practices when it comes to information security, but it will not be as in depth as your Qualys and Nessus. So that is one thing that people need to look out when going towards AWS Inspector. Okay, so when it comes to testing out your AWS, uh, compromising your AWS IAM keys is a big issue when it comes to securing and testing out your AWS environment. Why? Because a lot of people would have heard that some developer wanted to move their workbench from from office to home in order to work on a critical project that business wants to finish up or wrap up really early. And what they did was that they uploaded the AWS credentials on their GitHub, and using this, they would be able to, clone their repository and then use the AWS credentials in order to perform their dev or test workloads and provide the project on time. But what happens is that most at times those credentials are the configuration of the GitHub repository is not private but is public. So what happens in those cases is that those credentials can go in wrong hands, and if those IAM roles are configured to have uh, close to administrator or administrator privileges, then what they can do is that they can spin up instances, EC2 instances, in order to launch attacks or configure their C2 frameworks. A lot of APTs have done this practice, and it happens to do. It happens till date as well. Or notorious actors, what they can do is, using these credentials, if they find out that yes, this developer has administrator credentials, what they can do is they can spin up huge instances which are uh, really really pricey, and they might not do anything for those notorious actors, but for the organization the bill reaches to hundreds and thousands of dollars in just a matter of minutes. So as you can understand by those examples, what can happen is not only damage to the organization, but uh, damage to the reputation of the organization as well. So in any case, uploading credentials to public GitHub repository is anyway a security violation. In some cases, what happens is that the developers who perform these activities, they are asked to, they are subject to a lot of compliance violations, and most of the people would have heard stories about this. I need not say a lot about this, but a lot of stories would have been heard by security professionals as to what happens to those developers. uh, One thing to note is that bug bounty programs rate this issue as high to critical, because let's say if a credential leakage happens, it is as good as leakage of, sorry, which is part of their organization. And what happens here is that bug bounty programs, if those organizations are listed on bug bounty programs like HackerOne or BugCrowd, uh, sorry, just give me a minute. Really sorry for the interruption. Let me just share my screen again. Okay. So, as I was saying that, bug bounty programs, when it comes to, issues like, finding out, or security researchers reporting out AWS access keys and security keys or security tokens being reported to these programs, what they do is that because these are high to critical rated severity issues, the payout usually goes high, uh, but it is treated on priority because it is as good as having user credentials of an organization. But the good thing, how GitHub is trying to cope up uh, with accidental leakages like this, is that GitHub has a program which is performing a routine scan, and if you try to upload your credentials, your AWS credentials, within minutes, GitHub will send you an email that you have put up your credentials over public repository, and GitHub has taken that repository down. So you can try that on your own. I haven't tried that, so that's why it's missing from this slide. But uh, you can definitely go try that. But in some cases, like GitLab or Bitbucket, uh, since they don't perform this kind of activity, uh, people like notorious actors are always on the hunt for these kind of credentials. And you would notice when you run tools such as GitRob or GitHound, which perform routine scan of GitHub repositories to yield some sensitive data, you would see that there is a git ignore file which will contain these kind of credentials and some configurations for their workbench. So compromising AWS IAM keys is a really, really big issue when it comes to testing out AWS. And this is one of the significant issues that you would come across now and then, every now and then. If you just type IAM keys on HackerOne activity, you would find a lot of reports that exist on HackerOne alone. Okay, so when it comes to web applications, just like I said, you can find a lot on HackerOne about these issues. There's one more issue that happens over the web applications is SSRF, which is server-side request forgery. For those who don't know what SSRF is, any kind of web application that is interacting with underlying operating system resources using direct OS commands. If it is prone to SSRF, a particular attacker can send forged requests to the underlying server, letting it think that it's the server or the web application itself trying to perform that action. And because there is no active or passive filtering on those actions, what can happen is that you can perform local file read, you can perform code execution, you can perform sensitive data exposure, you know, uh, or even worse, uh, remote code execution. So these kind of issues happen when it comes to SSRF. So if a web application has SSRF, then what you can do is that you can potentially print out the access keys or IAM keys from the underlying EC2 instances. Uh, if the web application has local file read vulnerability, then what you can do is that you can call certain files, such as highlighted in this particular snapshot on the right, which is for AWS credentials. So default credentials which are of an IAM user are printed out. So uh, this is another way to compromise AWS IAM keys, but the success rate of this particular issue is really, really low when it comes to comparing it with the previous one, which is to find AWS IAM keys on GitHub or Bitbucket, because it requires a certain skill or precision to find out vulnerability existing on a web application, and that web application also needs to run on an EC2 instance. So finding out these kind of AWS IAM credentials through a web application issue is, the chances are really, really low as compared to the previous example. But yes, this is also another example on how do we can get these credentials of AWS IAM users. So there are a lot of things. For instance, S3 misconfigurations, wherein you can get the contents of a misconfigured S3 bucket. There are way many more examples, but those require a little bit of skill and expertise. And since it's a very beginner friendly presentation, I have not included that. But you're free to explore many other attacks when it comes to AWS, such as attacks over ECS or EKS, or malfunction or misconfigured VPC endpoints, or attacking the Route 53 services. So, there are a lot of attacks that exist for AWS alone, and its plethora. You can, refer to a lot of blogs out there, a lot of resources out there, which I have dropped a link. I will showcase the same. But when it comes to securing your cloud infrastructure or your environment, uh, it is always recommended to know the services offered by your cloud service provider. I mean, sure, there are a lot of services offered by AWS, but at least the core services, if you know those core services, that is at least helpful. Because if someone is throwing you a certain jargon, like, when they say that AWS Lambda, or, my database, it's a, I mean, uh, we have a DynamoDB, and then you think that where's the database? I mean, what is the underlying operating system of that database? Truthfully, DynamoDB is a serverless application. So knowing that service is really, really helpful. And how the cloud services provided are working. So when it comes to, people saying that, our data is stored on an Amazon RDS service, and then you say, what is the version of the NoSQL or MongoDB that is running? Actually, RDS does not run NoSQL services. It always runs SQL services. So in cases like this, they are very helpful to know what are the services provided, understand the technicalities of each services that are offered to secure our implementation. I mean, sure, it helps to, knowing those services, people who are very familiar with MySQL service or PGSQL service, they know that what kind of ports are open. But sometimes what happens is that certain other services which are dependent upon those services like AWS RDS. So you need to perform port whitelisting or blacklisting, and then you need to configure your security groups. So the secure implementation is as good as borrowing those services. And lastly, but not the least, use these cloud services more in your infrastructure, or at least as your personal hobby. And simply because you can't think ways of securing a service if you don't know how it runs, right? I mean, sure, a lot of people know that, you can perform a Windows or a Linux privilege escalation using these particular methods, right? If you don't use those methods, if you don't practice on Hack the Box or on any other service, you won't really know how to perform a privilege escalation. And that is why it's recommended to, to use these services as much as possible so that you know how to secure these services. When it comes to, you know, securing your AWS services, a framework is really, really helpful because uh, it has its own certain advantages that, when it comes to audit and compliance, people who are working in their organizations know that on a quarterly basis, or at least an annual basis, a security audit is bound to happen. And if that cloud service, okay, so really sorry about this. I'm having some network issues. So I left off at the second point, to use a framework to secure cloud infrastructure. Why does it have its advantages? Is number one, uh, auditors don't ask a lot of questions when you're achieving compliance in your AWS infrastructure. I mean, sure, there are a lot of security issues that come every now and then, but when you achieve a compliance, at least your AWS infrastructure has attained some sort of maturity, and you're able to at least mitigate the very basic threats and can focus upon advanced threats that can come across, uh, to your infrastructure. And it also helps in obtaining support from your management for resources and changes. Uh, Simply because when you exhibit compliance for your AWS infrastructure, the management is always going to entrust your intents, and seeing that your AWS infrastructure is compliant, not only just resilient and highly available, but compliant too from a point of security. The management's trust is always going to be achieved really, really easily. And that is not just my personal experience. If you go towards compliance, and if you attain some sort of compliance like, PCI or Sarbanes-Oxley, this kind of compliance, or ISO 27001 at least, you know speaking from a compliance perspective, the upper management knows that yes, our infrastructure is compliant. So any kind of security audit that happens at any time, at least they're going to sail through from a lot of questions that come from the auditors. And trust me, auditors ask really lot of questions when it comes to a security audit. SIP publication 800-144 highly focuses upon this kind of uh, the cloud security issues, specifically not AWS, but yes, I can't really recall. I'm sorry about that, but at least it uh, covers basic cloud security questions. I think it covers about AWS as well, but I will So I can circle back and let you know about this. Um, so this special publication 800-144 points out these security considerations that you need to account in on your secure AWS infrastructure. Uh, to organizations, various organizations and individuals, when you're outsourcing your infrastructure to these cloud service providers, uh, some AWS services are already compliant to certain existing standards. So, like I said, PCI, ISO 27001. So, some of the abstract services like your EC2, not EC2, but IAM and KMS, or some other services. There's a whole list of services that are listed on AWS, and these kind of services are compliant already. So you need not to worry about compliance, but you can always Melvin, can you hear me? I think I experienced another power cut, so I'm really not sure if it's being recorded or not. Hello.
We don't see your PowerPoint.
Okay, but you at least see my screen, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you are back. Go.
Okay, awesome. So, like I said, some AWS services are compliant to certain existing standards, such as PCI, ISO, Sarbanes-Oxley, SOC 1, SOC 2. There's a whole list of services that is given on AWS's website. I think I have left a link. It would be available in the references section once you download the PPT. Um, and when it comes to securing your AWS, routinely perform a VAPT exercise, because if you're performing routine VAPT exercise for your in-house infrastructure, and considering that you have your information uploaded to a cloud service provider such as AWS, then it is really helpful, and it should be imperative, needless to say, that security audits and VAPT are really helpful. And some controls which are already laid down, such as CIS controls, they are really helpful for reviewing your AWS services, such as your EC2 machine IDs, your machine instances, machine images. I apologize for that. So for your EC2 machine images and your instances, some controls are already laid out as to what you should imply when deploying these services and utilizing those services. Uh, Again, when it comes to securing your AWS, these are these services that you can imply in your AWS infrastructure. I know these are a lot of services, but most of the services are a cornerstone for AWS security. Uh, AWS has its own certification known as certification exam known as security specialty, and the exam not very complex, but at least the basic ones. And the rule sets, like every other WAF service provider, get updated. So since it's a managed service, you need not to worry. But yes, of course, you can always customize your own rules. Identity and access management, it's really important service, because a lot of times misconfigured or misconfigured IAM keys. Sorry, or misconfigured IAM keys or user IDs are the ones which are, which actually bring down the security of your AWS instances. A key management service helps you to store your cryptographic keys. So key management service, when it comes to, you know, using cryptographic keys on your Java application or any other application, key management service helps to securely store your cryptographic keys and to be used in your API calls or web application calls. AWS security groups are somewhat like your firewall, but these allow or deny your ports to every other service. So, for instance, if you want to allow or deny a particular IPs, or if you want to allow your only IP to a particular port, security groups are your go-to. Uh, Alerting and monitoring services. So, CloudWatch is one service that helps to identify what kind of logs and what kind of activities are happening on your AWS instances and to your environment as a whole. So CloudWatch is more or less like, accessing your uh, network manager, or audit, not audit manager, but I should say at least your alert manager, or it monitors lots of your services and API calls. So CloudWatch is really essential services to identify where the data transaction is happening and what kind of source and destination ports are being used. CloudTrail is a logging service which is used in combination with CloudWatch to perform proper logging, auditing, alerting, and monitoring. Uh, AWS billing, while it's not a security service per se, but let's say, for instance, if there is a mishappening that your credentials are leaked and those credentials hold administrative services, you need to know what kind of services are being spun up by notorious actors, and AWS billing at least helps you to identify where exactly the particular notorious actor is wreaking havoc in your AWS infrastructure. So billing as an essential service is helpful, and it can also fall into a security service if you're also, if you're looking out what kind of services are being used, not only by notorious actors, but your in-house developers as well. uh, Guard duty is one is a security service that comes in order to protect your AWS services from certain actors. It's not a VAPT service per se, but it's more or less like your firewall. So guard duty is a little bit complex service, which I'm fully not aware about. But yes, this is an essential security service that a lot of people use it to exhibit compliance. So yes, this is one of the services. Amazon Macy is relatively new service. Uh, Sorry. So Amazon Macy is relatively new service which performs data classification of about what kind of data is being stored uh, on your AWS instances or your AWS environment as a whole. Amazon Cognito is helpful in performing single sign-on activities. It leverages your Facebook, Gmail accounts in order to perform single sign-on to various applications, your web applications if you have developed, or you are leveraging single sign-on. So Cognito is your go-to. Amazon VPC more or less like your private subnet onto AWS. So if you want to hide your AWS EC2 instances or your whole infrastructure, Amazon VPC is a is a very big service. It's a widely adopted service in organizations. Those organizations who are using AWS as their go-to service provider, and those organizations who are using their AWS as a go-to service provider end up using AWS organizations as well. These are the essential services when it comes to AWS security. There may be more, there are more. Naturally, there are evolving services, and AWS is introducing a lot of services. But in my opinion, these are the essential services which you can use. It may not achieve compliance, but it at least grows you from point zero to somewhere in between achieving compliance. It may not achieve fully, I mean, it may not make your infrastructure fully compliant, but yes, these services are essential services when it comes to securing your AWS infrastructure. Okay, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of security enthusiasts who don't really care about, I mean, they're not really inclined. I mean, obviously they care about compliance if they're working in an organization, but they're not really inclined towards it. So there are a lot of services or a lot of applications and a lot of, uh, you know, uh, just like Hack the Box, you have your different local environments and online environments where you can practice your penetration testing skills for AWS. Uh, CloudGoat is uh, CloudGoat is something which allows to practice your AWS skills if you want to set up locally somewhere and then leverage it. Flaws.cloud, it actually is like your uh, it's actually a vulnerable environment which has a lot of S3 misconfigured buckets. So you can use this in order to improve your S3 penetration testing skills. Rhino Security Labs is a really good resource. It has a lot of blogs on penetration testing various services of AWS, such as ECS, EKS. A lot of examples that are present in this slide I have picked up from Rhino Security Labs. So it's really good. You should totally check out this particular blog service. Uh, there's a SANS book. So SANS has a lot of offerings. It not only, I mean, the range is huge. So it goes from mobile to DFIR. So SANS has also stepped into the cloud security environment, and especially when it comes to AWS, they have explored a lot of AWS services and securing those services. So there's a run book, or should I say, just, I mean, it's not a run book, it's a book. It's around 370-ish pages, which contains a lot of services, how to secure them, and what kind of security implementations you need to put in place when it comes to securing your AWS environment. AWS YouTube channel, especially the reInvent one, where they have a lot of talks about those services. They're introducing these services and going in depth on those services. uh, these should be your go-to. I mean, if you want to understand a lot about these services, uh, this is your go-to resource. AWS people talk about those resources and provide each and every aspect of those resources. So this can be one of your go-to resource. And AWS documentation has a lot of test cases to secure your environment, to not only just from a developer's perspective, but also from a compliance perspective as well as from a security operations perspective. So AWS documentation has a huge case studies documented, and they cover KMS, VPC, IAM, ECS, EKS, EC2. There are a lot of services that are documented in AWS documentation. So these 4 or 5 resources, I know they're very less when it comes to securing your AWS infrastructure, but in my opinion, I refer these services first and foremost because they cover a lot of services. They cover, you know, I mean, they tell you how to properly implement your services and at least maintain a level of security. So that's it. That's really it.